Through determination and ingenuity, by 1942, US cryptanalysts had deciphered the previously impenetrable World War II Imperial Japanese Navy code, known as JN-25. Japan had no idea America was listening. Buried within its encrypted chatter, a chilling revelation. A Japanese assault on the US Naval Station at Midway was imminent, promising devastation of an unseen scale. With this critical knowledge, US forces turned the predator into the prey. What the Japanese believed would be a decisive blow to the US Pacific Fleet was now meticulously engineered to be their own undoing, an ambush of the ambushers. As the chessboard was laid out, the first move fell on June 3, 1942. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's combined fleet breached the horizon, resolved to erase the US from the Pacific theater. Yet skimming through the azure canopy, American warbirds were already in play, primed to strike first at the unsuspecting foe. However, the meticulously crafted plan soon became a maelstrom of disarray and miscommunication. The scheme depended on fighters, dive bombers and torpedo bombers, each executing their roles, converging in a harmonized attack on the Japanese vessels. US pilots needed to engage the enemy on all fronts, fighters to control the skies, dive bombers for an aerial onslaught, and torpedo bombers skimming the sea to puncture the steel sides of the ships. But the reality of war seldom follows the choreography of the drawing board. Through a cruel twist of fate, the slower and lightly armored torpedo bombers of the VT-8 squadron found themselves leading the assault by themselves. At the helm of their outdated, cumbersome Douglas TBD Devastators, the airmen and their crew were grimly aware of their slender chances of survival. Without the protection of fighter escorts, they stood exposed to the deadly barrage of Japanese defenses, from swarming enemy fighters to the ceaseless storm of anti-aircraft fire. The Americans faced almost certain doom. As the Battle of Midway roared into action, the men of VT-8 squared their shoulders, ready to stare down their fate. Japan's initial objective was as straightforward as it was lethal: finish the job started at Pearl Harbor by annihilating the remainder of the US Pacific Fleet. Japan had come close to achieving this during the Pearl Harbor attack, but luck had intervened for the Americans. Their aircraft carriers were away on training exercises and escaped destruction. This fortunate coincidence gave the US a narrow but vital window of opportunity. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the experienced and strategic commander of the Japanese combined fleet, knew that another decisive naval battle was needed to eliminate the remaining US carriers. His strategy involved a multi-pronged approach that used Midway Island as the bait. Capturing Midway would extend Japan's defensive perimeter and make future US operations in the Pacific considerably more difficult. It would also provide Japan with a base for potential offensives against Hawaii and the US mainland. Japan's high command operated under the assumption that if they could land one more devastating blow to the remaining US naval forces, the Americans would be more likely to seek a negotiated peace. Such a settlement would allow Japan to solidify its gains and continue its military expansion across the Pacific unopposed, fulfilling its vision of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. However, Japan had underestimated the resourcefulness of American intelligence agencies. At Station Hypo in Hawaii, a team of cryptanalysts led by Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort cracked the Japanese JN-25 code, discovering an impending operation against a target designated as AF. To confirm that AF was Midway, US forces sent out a false message about a water supply issue on the island. When Japanese forces relayed a message about AF facing a water shortage, the Americans had the confirmation they needed. Armed with this invaluable intelligence, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Fleet, made a daring decision. Despite the risks involved in facing an enemy with superior numbers and firepower, Nimitz chose to defend Midway. He marshaled his available carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the recently repaired USS Yorktown, to set a trap for the Japanese. The American plan required perfect coordination among aircraft with different capabilities and roles: bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes. Their mission was to engage and cripple the Japanese carriers while avoiding heavy losses. The US also fortified Midway's defenses, anticipating potential Japanese attempts to invade the island. America would strike first, and they would strike hard, taking the Japanese by surprise and hopefully turning the tables. Instead of having the US Pacific Fleet destroyed, the US hoped to deal a devastating blow to Japan's Imperial Navy. The stage was set for an epic confrontation, one that would require nerves of steel, precise timing, and a fair amount of luck. For the brave men of the VT-8 Torpedo Squadron, the battle would test the limits of their skill and courage as they faced a formidable adversary, especially as the plan was about to go terribly wrong. Established in 1941, Torpedo 8 was destined to become part of the air group for the newly minted carrier, the USS Hornet. At its helm was Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, a seasoned naval aviator tasked to shape and lead this burgeoning squadron. Joining him in command was the squadron's executive officer, Lieutenant Harold Larson, another veteran in the sky. As Waldron briefed Larson of the daunting challenge before them, he grimly stated, quote, "We're getting fresh green kids. We've got to make fighting men out of them, and we may not have much time." Their mission was to turn these young recruits into combat-ready pilots, and time was of the essence. Among the flock of young aviators was Ensign George Gay, a Texan freshly minted from flight school. He was thrust into an intense training regimen along with the rest of the squadron, splitting time between hands-on flight practice and theoretical classroom instruction. Waldron and Larson painstakingly sculpted their raw, inexperienced pilots into a cohesive, battle-ready squadron as weeks turned into months. Equipped with the Douglas TBD Devastator, Torpedo 8 found itself armed with a plane that, once the pride of the US Navy, had become a relic of the past. When it first took to the skies in 1937, it was the epitome of modern aviation, a symbol of American ingenuity. But as the echoes of the Pearl Harbor attack still resonated in 1941, the Devastator had been left in the dust. The Devastator was hobbled by its sluggish speed, capping at a mere 206 miles per hour. This posed a significant drawback, especially when pitted against the Japanese fleet's blisteringly fast Mitsubishi A6M0, which could reach speeds exceeding 330 miles per hour. Its arsenal was similarly limited, able to carry only one torpedo or up to 1,200 pounds of bombs, and armed with a solitary 30 caliber machine gun at the nose and rear cockpit. Compared to the more heavily armed Japanese counterparts, it was gravely inadequate. The aircraft's shortcomings didn't end there. The Devastator lacked critical defensive features that had become standard by World War II, armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks. These omissions rendered the aircraft dangerously vulnerable to enemy fire. Consequently, the pilots of VT-8 found themselves in an unenviable position. Despite their rigorous training, they were tethered to an aircraft that was painfully outmatched by its Japanese adversaries in terms of speed, maneuverability, operational range, and defensive prowess. However, there was a glimmer of hope. VT-8 was on the docket to be among the first to receive the Devastator's successor, the Grumman TBF Avenger. Waldron eagerly anticipated their arrival, hoping to avoid taking the obsolete Devastators into battle, a scenario he considered nightmarish. Just as they were preparing to sail to the Pacific aboard the Hornet, a fleet of 21 Avengers arrived in March 1942. Larson was instructed to remain in Norfolk with a detachment of men to commence training on these state-of-the-art planes. Waldron, selecting his finest pilots, headed west with the aging Devastators. They would have to face the upcoming challenges with these outmoded warbirds. Throughout the early months of 1942, Torpedo Squadron 8 experienced more maritime exposure than combat. Their inaugural journey in April, accompanying the USS Hornet on its iconic mission to launch Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's air raid on Japan, yielded no combat action for the squadron. The Battle of the Coral Sea, the first actual carrier battle in history, unfolded just weeks later, but neither the Hornet nor VT-8 participated. Their trial awaited them in June. In the meantime, the American naval intelligence community began to detect significant Japanese advances eastward toward the Midway atoll. The Japanese naval strategists planned a diversionary strike on the Aleutians, an uninhabited island chain off Alaska's western edge, to conceal their main attack on Midway and draw out the American defense. By the end of May, the Japanese combined fleet, comprising over 200 ships, set sail eastward. Spearheading the attack was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's force, composed of 4 large fleet carriers. The orchestrator of the Pearl Harbor attack planned to assault Midway from the northwest and lie in wait for the American response. To the west, a potent force of battleships and cruisers led by Admiral Yamamoto aboard the super battleship Yamato prepared to strike. Meanwhile, the actual invasion force under Admiral Nobutake Kondo plotted their approach from the southwest. Fortunately, superior naval intelligence and effective code-breaking enabled American admirals at Pearl Harbor to plan Midway's defense. Accurate intelligence on Japanese intentions, force composition, and estimated arrival time allowed Midway's search planes to identify and track the approaching Japanese fleet. On May 28th, the Hornet and Enterprise and their escort ships set sail from Pearl Harbor, taking a position northeast of Midway. The urgency of their departure resulted in the first batch of new Avengers missing their scheduled arrival on the Hornet, leaving VT-8 with the obsolete Devastators for the imminent, decisive battle. Commander Waldron's worst fear had come true. His squadron was going into combat with the outdated Devastators. Despite this setback, Waldron prepared his men for battle, instructing them on tactics and briefing them about the Japanese. As George Gay remembers, quote, "We could almost read Waldron's thoughts because he had informed us so thoroughly of our roles under all conditions." The Hornet's air group, led by Commander Stanhope Ring, planned coordinated attacks involving dive bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes. Despite his unpopularity among the carrier's pilots, Ring intended for the planes to move in unison, launching a concerted assault on the Japanese fleet. He kept the fighter planes at a high altitude near the dive bombers, hoping to draw off the Japanese fighters. This strategy, however, diverged from the tactics employed at the recent Battle of the Coral Sea, where fighters were split to cover both bombers and torpedo planes. Waldron, fearing for his men, vehemently disagreed with the plan. He argued that his torpedo planes needed fighter protection for a successful attack. As the eve of battle approached, this disagreement remained unresolved. Still, time was of the essence, and the pilots readied to confront the Japanese fleet. A disquieting apprehension of entering battle without fighter cover lingered as they prepared for combat. The men of Torpedo 8, based in the Hornet's ready room, were up early to prepare for battle. A memo from Lieutenant CM Dr. Waldron awaited them, stating his hopes for a favorable tactical situation and encouraging each man to do his utmost to destroy their enemies. The pilots then performed their pre-flight routine, reviewing charts, maps, and data while receiving up-to-the-minute information on the unfolding battle. They were eventually informed that the Japanese fleet was sighted 180 miles northwest of Midway. This allowed them to establish an estimated future position for the enemy carriers and plan their attack route accordingly. A call from the loudspeaker prompted the pilots to man their planes. Waldron told his pilots they would strike regardless of the consequences. Shortly after, a hurried meeting was held under Admiral Mark Mitchell's supervision, the Hornet's commanding officer. Waldron argued for fighter protection for his squadron, but was overruled. He then heatedly debated with Commander Stanhope Ring about the best route to intercept the Japanese fleet. Ring refused to alter the original plan, despite Waldron's insistence that the enemy had turned north. The attack group, consisting of 35 dive bombers, 15 torpedo planes, and 10 fighters, took off to locate the Japanese carriers. Similar strike groups were launched from the nearby carriers Enterprise and Yorktown. Early into the flight, Waldron broke radio silence to continue arguing with Ring about the course to the Japanese carriers. Eventually, he veered his torpedo planes away from the rest of the air group, separating his squadron from the others. An hour into the flight, a plane appeared behind the squadron. Waldron warned his pilots, quote, "There's a fighter on your tail." However, the Japanese search plane from the cruiser Tone did not engage but rather radioed back to the carrier force, quote, "15 enemy planes are heading toward you." As the American planes made their way towards the estimated location of the enemy carriers, a Japanese search plane located Yorktown. This sighting prompted Nagumo's carrier force to adjust their course to the northeast as the Japanese admiral readied his forces to strike Yorktown. Consequently, the Japanese vessels would not be where the American aviators were expecting. Waldron, who had anticipated the enemy's change in course, was proven right. Around 9:25 a.m., an hour later, the pilots sighted smoke on the horizon. With a clear view, they could make out 3 enemy carriers, protected by a powerful escort of cruisers and destroyers. Waldron had successfully led his squadron directly to the Japanese carriers. Upon identifying the carriers, Waldron immediately transmitted the enemy's position and desperately called for coordination with the other Hornet squadrons. Despite his urgent pleas, the other squadrons were not within reach, as they had already redirected their course to the south. Torpedo 8 would be the only squadron from the Hornet to locate the Japanese forces that morning. Although a PBY Catalina patrol bomber may have picked up Waldron's message, there was no recorded reply and no evidence of it being received by any other attack squadron. Soon, the torpedo planes would attract the attention of Japanese fighters. Faced with a critical decision, whether to strike immediately unescorted or wait for other squadrons to conduct a coordinated attack, Waldron decided to strike. He signaled his decision to his unit by wiggling his wings, prompting the squadron to adopt an attack formation and descend to 60 feet above the Pacific Ocean waves. As the squadron moved closer together to concentrate fire from their rear guns, Waldron initially aimed for the southernmost carrier, but switched his focus to the central flat top when he noticed a barrage of anti-aircraft fire from a distance. When they were about 16,000 yards from the target, the squadron was engaged by approximately 30 Zeros, Japanese fighters that attacked from above and behind. One devastator on the left side of the formation was immediately engulfed in flames. Shortly thereafter, Waldron's plane was hit, the left fuel tank rupturing and catching fire. His crew could do nothing. Waldron was last seen trying to leave the cockpit before his plane descended, crashed into the water, briefly burned, and then sunk beneath the waves. Meanwhile, Japanese anti-aircraft gunners were also targeting the torpedo planes. Cruisers Chikuma and Tone among the screening ships opened fire in an attempt to directly hit the low-flying planes or create water splashes to disrupt their approach. Despite these efforts, 6 torpedo planes managed to evade the cruisers. 5 of the remaining 6 planes were shot down within a few minutes, leaving only George Gay to continue the attack. His rear gunner, Bob Huntington, was lost in action. Despite initially believing his target to be the carrier Kaga, historians later determined that Gay was actually attacking the Soryu. As Gay's plane faced heavy anti-aircraft fire and incoming enemy fighters, the carrier was executing hard, evasive maneuvers. Undeterred, Gay released his torpedo at a range of about 800 yards. Later, Gay would recall the harrowing moments. Quote, "I dropped the torpedo and was fortunate enough to get away from the anti-aircraft fire, although everything was shooting at me. As he flew directly over the carrier, he got a glimpse of the planes on deck and the anti-aircraft gunners who were scrambling to target his aircraft. He thought he heard the explosion of his torpedo hitting the target. However, subsequent reports revealed that no Japanese carrier was struck by a torpedo during the morning attack." George Gay's lone devastator was abruptly hit by a series of attacks from 5 Zero fighters, causing extensive damage to the plane and severely injuring Gay. One shell flash burned his left leg, a shell fragment hit his left hand, and a bullet struck his left arm. With the rudder control and ailerons obliterated, the devastator lost control and crashed into the ocean about a quarter mile behind the carrier. Upon impact, the cockpit hood slammed shut, trapping Gay inside. He managed to escape as the plane began to sink rapidly, leaving only the tail briefly visible above the water. A small deflated rubber boat and a black seat cushion floated by, which he grabbed. Aware of stories of Japanese planes attacking downed pilots in life rafts, Gay chose not to inflate his raft. He inflated his life jacket and hid under the seat cushion. Meanwhile, the Zero flight leader reported all 15 enemy torpedo bombers shot down. While floating and battling his intense pain, Gay removed a bullet from his left arm and held it in his mouth for safekeeping. Later, American dive bombers appeared, attacking the fleet and causing massive explosions and fires on 2 carriers. The burning ships gradually drifted out of sight. Gay watched as Japanese planes circled above, apparently searching for a place to land where there was no longer any. Later in the afternoon, a destroyer came dangerously close to Gay's location, prompting him to hide behind his seat cushion. He later described how he could have recognized anyone on board due to the proximity. The destroyer eventually moved on, and as twilight set in, Gay cautiously inflated his life raft. During the night, he noticed several glowing areas on the horizon, likely the burning carriers and searchlights of escort ships. Close to dawn, he heard 3 large explosions in quick succession. By morning, the ocean was littered with debris, and a thick layer of oil was visible in some areas. Abandoned Japanese life rafts drifted aimlessly, devoid of sailors. A few hours later, a Navy patrol plane investigating an oil slick spotted Gay's yellow raft. The plane acknowledged the sighting but continued with its mission, returning in the early afternoon to rescue him. Upon rescue, a sailor aboard the seaplane jokingly asked Gay, quote, "Seen any Jap planes lately?" After Gay confirmed he hadn't, the sailor continued, quote, "Good, let's get the hell out of here." Gay was rescued almost 30 hours after being shot down, marking him the sole survivor of the 15 Devastator crews of Torpedo Squadron 8. His survival was a testament to his courage and resourcefulness in the face of an extraordinarily dire situation. Following the valiant but devastating assault of Torpedo Squadron 8, 2 additional American squadrons located the Japanese carriers. Around 9:30 a.m., Torpedo Squadron 6 from the USS Enterprise launched an attack without the protection of fighter cover. Shortly after, around 10 a.m., Torpedo Squadron 3 from the USS Yorktown began their assault, while their 6 Wildcat fighter escorts were overcome by Japanese Zeros. Much like Torpedo 8, these squadrons mounted high-risk attacks. Their impact was critical, despite suffering heavy losses and failing to strike their targets. Of the 41 torpedo planes involved, only 6 returned. The squad leaders, like their predecessor Waldron, lost their lives in action. However, the tide of the battle dramatically turned at 10:20 a.m. Dive bombers from Bombing Squadron 6 and Scouting Squadron 6 of the USS Enterprise descended upon the Japanese carriers Kaga and Soryu. Almost concurrently, dive bombers from the USS Yorktown targeted the carrier Akagi. All 3 carriers were aflame within 5 minutes, the bombs finding their mark. The Japanese's anticipated victory had swiftly pivoted into a decisive American triumph, significantly influencing the trajectory of the entire Pacific theater. Despite missing their targets, the relentless torpedo attacks had a transformative impact on the battle's outcome. They forced the Japanese fighters out of position, with anti-aircraft gunners preoccupied with low-level threats, thereby leaving the higher altitudes unprotected. The defensive maneuvers required by the Japanese carriers to evade these attacks disrupted the launch of additional fighter planes. Consequently, when the American dive bomber assaults commenced, the Japanese air defense was unprepared and out of position, leading to their downfall. The selfless sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 during the Battle of Midway marked a turning point in the Pacific theater of World War II. These men bravely faced overwhelming odds, their sacrifice ensuring the broader mission's success. They diverted the enemy's attention, enabling the succeeding squadrons to strike the critical blows on the Japanese carriers. Their bravery, embodying the spirit of duty and selflessness, swung the momentum of the war in the Allies' favor. The story of VT-8 serves as a profound testament to the high cost of freedom and victory. Their sacrifice will not be forgotten,